The words were a prayer choked out by desperation, a whisper meant for the uncaring gods of the greasy alleyway. "I need a husband by tomorrow." Maya leaned her head back against the cold, damp brick of the diner, the red of her work vest a slash of defiant color against the grimy backdrop. The smell of stale coffee and fried onions clung to her, a scent she was sure would never wash out. Tears mixed with the fine mist of rain on her cheeks. She thought she was alone. A final, frantic phone call with the estate lawyer had confirmed it. The clause in her grandmother's will was ironclad. To inherit the small house that was her only link to a stable past, she had to be legally married by her 25th birthday, which was tomorrow. A cruel, ridiculous joke played by a woman she had adored. A joke her predatory cousin, Marco, was waiting to cash in on. He'd be there at noon, ready to see her fail, ready to snatch the last piece of her family from her hands. She squeezed her eyes shut, the pressure behind them unbearable. It was impossible. A hopeless, frantic, final plea to an empty night. She was wrong. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the dumpsters. It was a man, tall and impossibly still, wrapped in a long gray coat that seemed to absorb the dim city light. The white of his collared shirt was a stark contrast, pristine and out of place. He moved with a silence that was more unnerving than a sudden noise. He hadn't been there a second ago. And yet he was. He stopped a few feet away, his face a mask of polite indifference, but his eyes held an unnerving intensity, dark and deep. They weren't just looking at her. They were assessing her, cataloging her frayed nerves, the tear tracks on her skin, the tremor in her hands. "You have a deadline," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, a smooth baritone with an edge like chipped stone. "I have a proposition." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was how bad stories started, in dark alleys with strangers who materialized from thin air. "I don't know who you are," she stammered, trying to find a strength she didn't possess. "I have a solution to your problem," he continued, ignoring her fear. "I require a wife. A temporary arrangement. It would be a contract, mutually beneficial. You secure your inheritance. I secure an asset." The word hung in the air, cold and transactional. He was talking about marriage the way one might talk about acquiring a new piece of property. He was a Korean man of obvious wealth and power, the kind she saw stepping out of black cars downtown, men who lived in a different universe. Why would a man like him need a desperate waitress from a dead-end diner? The agreement was signed in an office that smelled of old leather and new money. It was high in a glass tower that scraped the clouds, the city sprawling beneath them like a circuit board. The man's name was Jean. Just Jean. His lawyer, a severe woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to hurt, explained the terms with chilling clarity. Maya would receive a significant sum of money, enough to solve problems she hadn't even dared to imagine yet, in addition to securing her house. She would be Mrs. Min. She would live in his home, attend functions by his side, and present to the world a picture of domestic stability. Her life, for the duration of the one-year contract, was his to direct. There were clauses about discretion, loyalty, and conduct. It felt less like a marriage certificate and more like an indenture agreement. "My world has specific rules," Jean said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. "You will learn them. You will follow them. In return, you will be protected. Anything that threatens you threatens my interests. And I protect what is mine." The possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver down her spine that was equal parts terror and a strange, unwelcome thrill. He wasn't a CEO in the way she understood the term. The men who stood like sentinels outside the office door, the deference in the lawyer's eyes, the palpable aura of danger that clung to him like expensive cologne. This was something else. He was a Korean mafia boss. The thought screamed in her mind, a realization that settled deep in her bones. She was making a deal not with a businessman, but with a king in a kingdom of shadows. She picked up the pen, her hand shaking. The ink was a deep, damning black against the crisp white paper. She signed her name, and with it, her life. The courthouse was a blur of fluorescent lights and bureaucratic apathy. A bored judge mumbled words that legally bound her to the formidable man beside her. Jean was a statue of controlled calm, his hand a firm, warm presence on the small of her back. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that made him look less like a groom and more like a beautifully dressed executioner. There was no joy, no ceremony, just the cold finality of a transaction completed. But the deal wasn't over. It had just begun. "We have an engagement this evening," he informed her in the back of a silent, gliding town car. "A charity gala. Many of my associates will be there. You will be introduced, my first public test," she thought, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. A gatekeeper, a young man with sharp eyes, met them at a luxury boutique, where racks of gowns awaited. Jean gestured vaguely. "Choose one." Maya, who had spent her life in polyester uniforms and second-hand jeans, felt adrift in a sea of silk and satin. She chose a simple, elegant navy dress, something that felt like armor. When she emerged from the dressing room, Jin's eyes swept over her, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "Acceptable," he murmured, though the way his gaze lingered felt like something more. At the gala, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet power. Jewels glittered at throats and wrists. Men in tailored suits spoke in low tones, their smiles rarely reaching their eyes. It was a room full of sharks, and she was the new, unfamiliar bait. Then she saw him.
Marco.
Her cousin was schmoozing with a portly man, a champagne flute in his hand, a smug grin plastered on his face. When his eyes found her, they widened in shock, then narrowed with venomous disbelief. He excused himself and stalked toward them, his confidence a cheap imitation of the lethal grace Jean possessed. Well, Maya," he sneered, his gaze flicking dismissively over her. "Playing dress-up? What is this?" Jin's hand tightened on her back, a silent command.
"Perform."
Maya lifted her chin, channeling a confidence she didn't feel. "Marco, I'd like you to meet my husband, Jean Min." She held up her left hand, where a heavy, impossibly large diamond now sat. The shock on Marco's face was a small, satisfying victory. He stared at Jean, his bravado faltering as he took in the sheer, intimidating presence of the man beside her. "Husband," he spluttered. "You're lying. My wife does not lie," Jean said, his voice soft, yet it cut through the ballroom chatter like a razor. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Marco paled, finally understanding he was no longer dealing with his timid, downtrodden cousin. He was facing a dragon, and he had just insulted its treasure. The test was passed, but the war had just been declared. The danger became real 2 days later. Marco wasn't just a greedy fool, he was a reckless one. He must have done some digging, pulled some strings, and found nothing on Jean Min through conventional channels. The absence of information was, to a man like Marco, proof of fraud, not a warning of immense power. Maya was leaving a small cafe near the penthouse Jean called home, a place he had deemed secure, when a heavy-set man blocked her path. He wasn't physically imposing in the way Jin's guards were, but there was a wiry desperation in his eyes. "Marco sent me," he grunted, grabbing her arm.
"He wants a little chat."
"Wants to know what kind of game you're playing with his family's money." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Maya. This was it. The consequence. The reality of the world she had stepped into. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me," she said, her voice trembling. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "None till we have our talk." Suddenly, a black car screeched to a halt beside them. Before the man could react, 2 of Jin's guards were out of the car, moving with a fluid, terrifying efficiency. They didn't speak. One simply grabbed the man's wrist, applying pressure until he cried out and released Maya. The other guard stood between her and the threat, a silent, immovable wall. Jean emerged from the car, his face a thunderous mask of cold fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The temperature on the street seemed to drop by 20 degrees. He walked slowly toward the man, who was now pale and sweating, held fast by the guard. Jean stopped directly in front of him, his dark eyes boring into the man's soul. "You touch my wife," he said, the words precise and deadly. He lifted a hand and adjusted his own cufflink, a small, deliberate movement that was more menacing than any overt threat. "You made two mistakes. The first was accepting a job from a fool. The second," he paused, his gaze flicking to Maya for a split second, "was believing you would be allowed to carry it out." He nodded once to his men. They bundled the man into a second car that had appeared as if from nowhere and vanished into traffic. Jean turned to Maya, his expression unreadable but for the lingering storm in his eyes. He gently took her arm, his touch surprisingly soft as his thumb brushed over the red marks left by the other man's grip. "This will not happen again," he vowed. It wasn't a comfort, it was a promise of brutal retribution. That night, she learned from a hushed conversation she overheard that Marco's messenger had been deposited on his doorstep, broken and terrified, with a simple message: "Stay away." The danger was real, but so was the protection. She had traded one cage for another, but this one, for all its terror, had bars of steel. The incident was a turning point. Jean realized that protecting Maya wasn't enough. She had to be able to protect herself, or at least project an aura of untouchability. She was a vulnerability, a soft target in a world of predators. That had to change. The next morning, she was introduced to Ms. Kim, a woman in her 50s with the posture of a drill sergeant and eyes that missed nothing. She was Jin's head of security, a former intelligence operative, and now Maya's personal tutor in the art of survival. "Your husband believes you are a liability," Ms. Kim stated without preamble, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "My job is to make you an asset. We begin immediately." The next 3 months were a blur of intense, grueling transformation. The lesson started with poise and etiquette. Ms. Kim taught her how to walk into a room as if she owned it, how to command attention with silence, how to meet a powerful man's gaze without flinching. "Weakness invites aggression," she would repeat, correcting Maya's posture with a sharp rap of a ruler. "You are the wife of Jean Min. You will project nothing but strength." Then came the lessons in observation. Maya was taken to crowded restaurants and quiet parks and taught to see everything. The man whose watch was too expensive for his shoes. The woman whose smile was a fraction too bright. The car that passed the same corner twice. She learned to memorize faces, license plates, and conversations overheard in passing. Her mind, once cluttered with worries about bills and tips, became a sharp, analytical tool. The final phase was physical. It wasn't about turning her into a fighter, but about giving her the confidence to escape. She learned basic self-defense, how to break a grip, where to strike for maximum effect, how to use an opponent's momentum against them. Every evening, she would collapse onto the fine silk sheets of her enormous, empty bed, her body aching, her mind buzzing with new information. Jean was a constant, observant presence during this time. He would appear silently at the end of a training session, his eyes assessing her progress. He never offered praise, but she saw something shift in his gaze, a flicker of respect, perhaps even pride. He was forging her into a weapon, a shield, a queen for his dark kingdom. And through the brutal process, something else was being forged between them. A bond built not on romance, but on shared purpose and mutual survival. She was becoming more than just a name on a contract. She was becoming his partner. One evening, after a particularly brutal session with Ms. Kim that had left her with a bruised cheek and a throbbing wrist, Maya was soaking in the enormous marble bathtub when Jean entered their suite. He rarely came into her section of the vast, minimalist space, respecting an unspoken boundary. But tonight was different. He carried a small, ornate wooden box. He didn't speak, simply knelt by the side of the tub and took out a jar of dark, fragrant salve. "This will help with the bruising," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He gestured for her hand. Hesitantly, she lifted her wrist from the warm water. His touch was incredibly gentle as he massaged the ointment into her skin. The heat of his fingers contrasted with the cool salve, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with pain. They were silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft dripping of water. "Why are you doing this?" she finally whispered, looking at his bowed head, the way his dark hair fell over his forehead. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, the mask of the formidable mafia boss was gone. She saw a flicker of something else, something weary and vulnerable. "In my world," he began, his voice a low murmur, "everything is a transaction. Loyalty is bought. Fear is a currency. Trust is a weakness to be exploited." He paused, his thumb tracing a slow circle on her pulse point. "You are a transaction. But you are not weak. And you have not exploited anything. You endure." He looked away, toward the glittering cityscape visible through the floor-to-ceiling window. "My father was a man of honor, but he was surrounded by jackals. They took everything from him when he showed a moment of kindness. I swore I would never make that mistake." It was the most he had ever revealed about himself, a crack in the formidable armor. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming, more potent than any kiss. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, and yet, in that quiet bathroom, he felt like the only safe harbor in the world. He finished tending to her wrist and stood up, his professional mask sliding back into place, but not before she saw the conflict in his eyes. The contract was a simple piece of paper. The feelings growing between them were a complicated, dangerous web. The deal was no longer just a deal. It was becoming real. The shift in their dynamic sharpened Maya's senses. She was no longer just a passenger in Jin's world. She was an active participant, and her training had taught her to look for the cracks in the facade. She started noticing small things. Marco, at the few family events she was forced to attend, was no longer just smug. He was nervous, his eyes constantly darting around. He was taking hushed phone calls, his face pale and sweaty. He was spending money he didn't have, flashing a new watch, driving a new car. It didn't add up. Using the observational skills Ms. Kim had drilled into her, Maya started to piece it together. She paid attention to the names Marco accidentally let slip, names she cross-referenced with the files she knew Jean kept in a study, a room she was forbidden from entering. One night, fueled by a gut feeling she couldn't ignore, she picked the lock. It was a simple trick Ms. Kim had taught her, intended for escape, but now used for infiltration. Inside, the room was a fortress of information. She found the file on a rival organization, a brutal faction known for their recklessness. And there it was, a sub-file on their recent financial dealings, detailing large, untraceable payments to several shell corporations. On a hunch, she searched for the account numbers Marco had once boasted about in a loud phone call. They matched. Marco wasn't just in debt. He was on the payroll of Jin's most dangerous enemy. He was a traitor. The full picture slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Marco planned to publicly challenge the legitimacy of her marriage at the upcoming Family Foundation Gala. When he succeeded, he would inherit the house and the considerable trust fund attached to it. But it wasn't for him. He was going to use the entire inheritance to fund the rival faction, buying his way into their good graces and financing an attack on Jean himself. He was using her family's legacy to sign her husband's death warrant. Her blood ran cold. She found a hidden audio file on Jin's encrypted server, a recording from a bug. It was Marco's voice, clear as day, speaking with the rival leader. "The inheritance will be mine after the gala," he was saying. "And then, your problem with Jean Min will be solved." Permanently, this was it. The ultimate betrayal. The public showdown was no longer about a house. It was about life and death. Maya copied the file onto a hidden drive. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. Marco had made a fatal mistake. He still saw her as the helpless waitress from the diner. He had no idea he was about to face the queen of a dark new world. The night of the Foundation Gala was thick with tension. The grand ballroom was filled with the city's elite, a mix of old money and the shadowy figures who truly ran the streets. Jean was by her side, a bastion of calm, but Maya could feel the coiled energy beneath his stillness. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know she was the one holding the blade. Marco took the stage halfway through the evening, a triumphant smirk on his face. He held a microphone, his voice booming through the speakers, dripping with false sincerity. "Friends, family," he began, "I'm afraid I must bring a delicate matter to your attention. A matter of fraud, of deception, that affects the very heart of my dear departed grandmother's legacy." A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Maya and Jean. "My cousin, Maya, has presented this man," he gestured dismissively at Jean, "as her husband to claim an inheritance she did not earn. But their marriage is a sham. A lie concocted to steal what is rightfully mine." He produced a folder, waving it in the air. "I have affidavits. I have proof. She was a desperate, broke waitress one day, and the wife of a supposed tycoon the next. It is a lie, and I demand it be exposed." The crowd murmured, their gazes turning from curious to accusatory. This was the moment Marco had planned, the public humiliation that would destroy her credibility and deliver him his prize. Jin's hand rested on her back, a silent offer of protection, of retreat. But Maya gently stepped away from him, moving toward the stage. She looked not at Marco, but at the assembled guests, her expression calm and resolute. "He's right about one thing," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified by a microphone a stagehand gave her. "I was a desperate waitress. I was alone, and I was in trouble." She paused, letting the admission hang in the air. "But he is wrong about the rest." She turned her cool gaze on Marco, whose smug expression began to falter. "My marriage is very real." But Marco isn't interested in the truth. He's interested in money. Specifically, my grandmother's money. And he needs it badly from a small clutch purse. She produced a single USB drive. She handed it to the audiovisual technician. "Please play the audio file labeled Betrayal." A moment of confusion, and then Marco's voice filled the silent ballroom, panicked and greedy. "The inheritance will be mine after the gala. And then, your problem with Jean Min will be solved." Permanently, gasps echoed through the hall. Marco's face drained of all color. He was exposed, his treason laid bare for all to hear. The power in the room didn't just flip, it shattered. The whispers were no longer about her. They were about him. She wasn't finished. "He wasn't just planning to steal from my family," she announced, her voice ringing with cold fury. "He was planning to use our name and our legacy to finance a war against my husband." She turned to face the powerful, dangerous men in the room, men who understood the language of loyalty and betrayal better than anyone. "He made a deal with your enemies. He is a traitor in your midst." The judgment in the room was swift and silent. Marco was no longer a man. He was a liability. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror, as two of Jin's men moved toward the stage with grim purpose. Maya looked at Jean. The surprise, the shock, and the overwhelming pride in his eyes were her true victory. She hadn't been a damsel to be rescued. She had been the sword. In the quiet aftermath, the penthouse felt like a sanctuary above a conquered city. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. Marco was gone, dealt with in the swift, silent way Jin's world dealt with traitors. The inheritance was secure. The contract, technically, was fulfilled. Maya stood by the vast window, watching the distant lights, feeling the weight of the last few months settle on her. She could leave now. She could take the money, the house, and walk back into her old life, forever changed but free. The thought held no appeal. Her old life felt like a photograph of a stranger. This world of danger and shadows, with him at its center, was now the only one that felt real. Jean came to stand beside her, the scent of his cologne a familiar comfort. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the city breathe below. "You are magnificent," he said finally, his voice low and laced with an emotion she had never heard from him before.
"Ah."
"Ms. Kim taught me to be observant," she replied softly. "But she didn't teach me what to do." "I did that on my own." "Yes, you did," he agreed. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. It was their contract. He walked over to the sleek, modern fireplace and, with a flick of a switch, a line of clean blue flame appeared. Without ceremony, He dropped the paper into the fire. They watched it curl, turn black, and disappear into ash. The legal tie that bound them was gone, dissolved into smoke. But the real bond, the one forged in fear, respect, and a fierce, unspoken devotion, remained. He turned back to her, his dark eyes searching her face. The power, the danger, the imposing presence of the mafia boss were all there, but now they were tempered by a raw vulnerability meant only for her. That paper was a necessity, he said. A tool to solve a problem. But it was never the truth. He stepped closer, closing the small space between them. He gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone, the one that had been bruised just weeks before. "I told you I protect what is mine," he murmured, his voice thick with feeling. "The contract is over, Maya. But you are mine. If you will have me," she didn't need to answer with words. She leaned into his touch, her heart, once frantic and scared, now beating with a strong, steady rhythm. She had walked into a deal with the devil and found an angel in the darkness. Her world would always be dangerous, but she would no longer face it alone. She had found her husband, not for a day, but for a lifetime. And in his arms, for the first time, she was truly home.